Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is Please Bother Me, supporting first generation students through moments of shame. And we have Dana Kemery, who is our Director of Innovative Course Design and Technological Infusion, and also Duran Corley, Assistant Director of the TRIO Student Support Services Program at Rutgers University, Camden. So now let me throw it over to Dana. Dana, introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you for coming this afternoon and spending some time with us. Dr. Cooley and I are presenting in February 2nd and 3rd at the Flying First Gen Symposium at Rowan University. If you are interested at all in first gen students and the perspectives of first gen students, this is an excellent symposium to attend. It is virtual. And it's only $10, so it's worth the $10 to go. They allow students to come in and present, so you get not only an academic perspective of what it's like to work with first-gen students as faculty or as support services or student affairs professionals, but also the student perspective. So it's a really great conference symposium. They've been doing it for a couple of years now, and I always find it very meaningful. So this is my colleague, Dr. Duran Corley. You guys all know me, so I'm not going to go into all my stuff and my pedigree. Everybody knows me. Everybody probably knows my email by now too, but I'm going to let Dr. Corley introduce himself and talk a little bit about his work at Rutgers Camden.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out and also to greet those of you who are catching the replay. My name is Duran Corley. I always joke that is today Tuesday? Today is Tuesday, so you could drop the doctor. I'm Duran Corley, but I serve as the Assistant Director for the TRIO Student Support Services Program at Rutgers University in Camden. If you heard of TRIO is funded by the Department of Higher Education. If you heard of EOF, EOP, or ACT program, basically TRIO is the federal branch of what those programs are. And what we do is we serve three populations: first generation students, students who are low income, and students who have a documented disability. And our goal is really just to improve the retention and graduation rates for these student populations. So I've been in that role for about going on 4 years, I believe, at Rutgers. I really love what I do. And also, I really have a great passion for our first generation college students. So for today's presentation, Dana and I came up with a topic that we presented for a few times. Really across the nation, and we're glad to bring it to Drexel University. And it's called Please Bother Me, supporting college students, our first generation college students, through moments of shame. And what we want to do today is just really to talk about this topic of shame and really bring it from a perspective of somebody who works in faculty, right? And also for someone who works in the student affairs branch of education. So when we look at today's overview, there's a few things that we want to do. The big thing is we want to make sure that with our participants today, this is an interactive participation. So we do not want to talk the whole entire time, but we really want to make sure that we do get to participation from you all. The other thing is too, we do not come into this work as the experts, right? We're both practitioners, and we would love to get your input, some of the things that you have done, some of the work that you have done with students when it came to shame. We really would like to get your input as well as this topic, okay? So feel free to share your experience and any strategies that you have used. But today we're going to talk about who are our first generation college students, right? We'll do some group discussions. We'll ask you for some feedback. We'll explore some of the concepts of shame and some of its underlying factors. And we'll be able to identify shame in the academic setting. We'll also do some more group work in reviewing a case study. And then finally, we will close out and discuss the shame recovery process.
So as part of the interactive piece of our session, we're using Poll Everywhere. We'll also have a slide where we're going to ask you to either grab a microphone or chat in if you like. So this is the poll everywhere, respond information that you need, and you can use text. You can just text your responses. Dana Kemmery, 556 to 37607, and then respond by text or go to the web to use the poll everywhere.
Let's first have a quick conversation about who our first generation college students are, right? And one of the things that we want to emphasize in presenting you this slide is that many of our first generation college students, they do have multiple identities. And that's just to say there's many other things that make up who they are. So there's a few definitions of first gen, but at least for this conversation that we're having with you today, we're going to use the definition of students whose parents did not obtain a bachelor's degree. So if your institution as well as Rutgers were four-year institutions. But let's talk very briefly about who's included in these populations, right? So we have our international students, our LGBTQIA plus students, students who are limited income, but students who could also be middle or high income, right? Sometimes in working in higher education, some professionals or staff members, they will have the concept that or the misconception that all first gen are low income, and that's not necessarily true, right? We have students who are non-native English speakers. We have traditional and non-traditional college students, for the non-traditional students who are over that age of 24. We have students who are parents, right? Who are coming in to go out after their degree. We have students of color, students who have a disability. I know at Rutgers, we do have students who are veterans, who are also first generation college students. And we have students who I believe transfer into both of our institutions, right? So this here is just to show that when we think about first generation college students, it's a really big population of students who have multiple identities.
Let's take a poll. How often do you hear a student begin a sentence with, "I apologize for bothering you, but," or if you are a student and you don't interact with students in this way, how often do you say this yourself, or have you heard it from other people? If you could put that in the chat, that'd be great. Or if you don't want to use the chat, grab a microphone. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So we have weekly. Yep, weekly. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Lee. Right. So it happens quite often in other presentations that we've done on this particular topic. We hear many times a day and daily, most often. So we have been gathering data from our presentations that we've done with not only faculty and support services staff and student affairs professionals, also with students themselves who are acting as mentors for other first-gen students. And when someone makes this type of statement, I apologize for bothering you, right? They're actually thinking that their questions, right? That they're not allowed to ask you questions, or that they're, taking up your time and their issues aren't very important, right? But we want to then make sure that we're communicating that these things are. We can go to the next slide, Ron. So you're going to hear it. And now that you're thinking about it, you may hear it more often. You may hear students say this to you more often. So why do you think students feel asking us for help is bothering us as part of the role that you currently hold? So grab a microphone or put that in the chat. Why do you think that is? What are the different reasons?
I think that oftentimes there's this power dynamic between advisor and student, right? And I think it's very common for students to see us as this kind of omnipotent service on campus. And I think that they think that, oftentimes we're going out of our way, right, to help them. And really that's our role. But I think if I could attribute it to anything, it would probably be this kind of power dynamic between advisor and student.
A power dynamic, absolutely. And in the text chat we have, they may think it's a silly question to ask. And that's very true, right? So you think about first-gen students and the first-gen's perspective, they're often not sure about what goes on in all the higher ed environments, right? And what is a silly question to ask, right? And we try to support them by saying there are never any silly questions, because we all have questions all the time. But that's something that we hear quite a bit. And Lee's sharing that you have some students who feel they should be able to figure it out. That's right. What on their own, and feel out of their comfort zone, right? When asking for another university professional for help. And again, that's part of the power dynamic, and part of, not feeling like they're not understanding, right, what goes on in higher ed, right? And even some of the terms are confusing. I myself, and Duran as well, I'll use your first name since you offered that. We're both first-gen students. And when I share that with my students, it's a look of surprise often. And then they'll share with me, oh, well, I am too. And then I laugh and I say, okay, so let me tell you a story, because all of y'all know me, know I tell stories all the time. And I say, when I first heard the word bursar, I had no idea what that meant. None, zero. Duran and I laughed because we had the same experience. I'm like, I didn't want to ask because I didn't know, but I didn't know what they were talking about when they said the bursar. I didn't know that's where you go and take your check, or, your payment, or the people that deal with the money. So, you do, like, students really do feel like that's kind of exposing them, right? And you don't want to do that. You don't want to be perceived as, not knowing, especially in the student role. So what is shame then, right? So we're kind of dancing around what shame is at this point. So it's about the person, not about the act. So it's not the act of asking a question that to someone else's ear may sound silly. It's what that does to you inside, right? And how that makes you feel. Like you feel that you're not capable, you're not able, right? It's that inward focus, right? And that can lead to impediments to learning and engagement. Because if I feel like you're looking at me like I'm less than, then I'm not going to want to reach out to you. I'm not going to engage with you, because I'm going to be afraid that you're going to look at me and you're going to see me as silly and incompetent and all the things that we tell ourselves, right? Or that our students tell themselves. And that's not good, right? We want to have that open door, and we don't want students holding on to that shame, right? We want to help them work through it and help them to realize that no one knows everything, right? And they're not expected to. So this part is definitely Mike and Chad. Where do you think that comes from? That shameful feeling, where is that coming
I think all students, and maybe particularly first gen, they're comparing themselves to others. They're seeing others in their classrooms and in their interactions. They might feel that there's certain expectations or things like that that they're feeling.
I think, when a student asks a question and apologize, and this is just my thought, it's something I think it's learned, or it has happened to them before. They really have a fear sometimes of asking, and there's some of the things that were mentioned before, they're embarrassed about it. And I'm just thinking sometimes when I ask a question, and I apologize, when you were discussing from the beginning, I'm like, oh, should I ask the question or not? But then I feel like it's probably a question that somebody else wants to say as well. So I think it's a number of things. Maybe it's something, and then I'm thinking of peer pressure that they may have or experience. It could be a number of things that's going on with the student.
Yeah, Denise, as you were saying that, one of the things that came to mind, sometimes students feel as though they should already know this, right? And that's the reason why, sometimes students do not want to ask the question, because they will make that assumption, well, I should already know this. So I would look silly. I think somebody put that in the chat earlier for asking this question, because I should already know the answer. So that's a very good point.
Anyone else have any thoughts on where this shame is coming from? Now think about it too. The role of a first gen student within their family or within their community, sometimes they carry all that and the impacts of all that with them, right? So being seen as weak or less than or what have you is not part of their role, right? That's not part of how they see themselves. And oftentimes viewing back at themselves, that creates that shameful environment, right? That they can't ask because if they ask, then they don't know. It dovetails very nicely with Dweck's theory of, are you an entity person? Are you, a person that thinks about themselves in a broader way? Are you smart or do you work hard to learn? In essence, what Dweck says about, how we see ourselves as learners. So this happens with a lot of students, not just first gen, but it comes out very, very clearly in a lot of the first gen literature and experiences that you'll hear. So Hashman does a really nice job of kind of breaking this down with the underlying factors of shame. So a limited self-awareness, right? Not really understanding your place in this space, right? The self-blame, pretty common. The standards that they put on themselves, not necessarily the external standards, but they put themselves. We tend to put ourselves, against a really, really high bar, right? Because we don't realize that the reality is that nobody is hitting that high bar all the time. I don't belong here because, I came from X and so high school, or my family, no one in my family went to college, and why am I here? All of that, right? So that questioning themselves and putting those unbelievable standards on themselves. Their own personal traits, right? First gen students tend to be driven, right? They're driven. They've got themselves here, right? Sometimes without any help, or with limited understanding of how to get here from their family. And then so that helped them, right, persist and sustain until they got to the door of the institution. But now they're feeling like they can't ask questions because they've done it all themselves, type of deal. And then their own self-esteem, and how when you are reaching out for help, how that can impact your self-esteem, because often first gen students are they're the saviors, right? They're the ones who have done this all along for everyone else. And that kind of takes a hit on their self-esteem when they have to reach out for help.
So one of the things that we want to also talk about real quick is what does shame do, right? So Dana did a great job of just discussing some of the underlying factors, but really what does it do? And one of the big takeaways we really want you to take away from this is that it really undermines the individual's positive self-concept. So we talk about how they see themselves, their identity. So really what shame is, it's really an attack on self, right? And a lot of times for our first generation college students, they come in a form of negative judgments about themselves. So you will often hear to say, I don't think I'm cut out for this. I don't think I'm cut out for this major. I don't think I could be successful. And these are, like Nana was saying in the last slide, these are just these personal things that are dwelling inside of them. But also it could damage their connection to other people, right? And oftentimes when working with students, we see this, right? We see this when students start to self-isolate or to, socially isolate. So we had a student in the beginning of the semester, they seem to be bubbly, you always saw them, and then all of a sudden, now the new term is they ghost us, right? But that's a way, that's a sign, right? That isolation. And also I noticed in my work with my students, sometimes you have this sense of powerlessness, right? Where they just don't see themselves having the power, right? And often too, you can also see where they do not have any type of movement, right? I call this that paralysis, right? So there's no movement, there's no advancement, there's no progress. But it's also diminished power, a sense of power and control. And this is where students will begin to avoid, or they will show the behavior of withdrawing themselves, right? And they won't talk to people. they will try to avoid a situation, or they will avoid the pain. So these are some of the things that we see in our daily work, and we'll also discuss a little bit more of how we see this in an academic setting, whether it's in the classroom or in our one-on-one work, whether you're an academic advisor or if you're in housing. We can also show you areas in which you will see this. So what are some of the personal academic difficulties, right, that our first-gen students experience that lead to shame? So I'm going to take the first half, talk about the personal, and then Dana will come in and talk about the academic. One of the big things we notice is family expectations, right? And this is a very big thing, especially now that, we're in COVID, right? I think COVID really shown how expectations are a really big a part of how students can have shame, right? So when you talk about expectations, you talk about, the family talking about a student's major, whether that major is good enough, whether that major is going to be worthwhile, right? And sometimes students feel that pressure that they have to perform, right? And I have to do very well, right? Excuse me. Sometimes also with family expectations, some students carry the burden of thinking that they're too good. Some of their siblings may be jealous, the fact that they're in college and they are not. It seems like this child is getting extra attention and they are not. So sometimes it could result into shame. Imposter syndrome, right? Believing that they do not belong, right? That could be within a major, that could be within the classroom, but feelings also not being enough, right? We also have limited social capital. So when we think of capital, we're thinking about those resources, those relationships, right? And being the first in college, you may not have those relationships just yet. They take some time for us to cultivate, right? But sometimes when students are struggling, they will internalize that, right? And they can often become overwhelmed. And then Dana just touched on this about being first. There's a weight to being the first person. One, a lot of times our students don't have a point of reference. And I know one of the things I have to work on as a first generation college student myself, right, is saying sometimes students don't know what they don't know, right? And using the opportunities to equip them and to teach, right? Instead of saying, well, you should know this, why don't you know this, right? But that's one of the results of being first. But also that I also just touched on about being a family savior. So some students will come to our institutions with this concept that, hey, look, I'm the first person in my family going to college. If I don't do this right, I'm letting down my whole family. I'm letting down my community. And they really take that personal. So these are just some of the personal things that we see. Dana, how about the academic?
So for the academic side of the house, right, the first point is failure. And the reason why we put failure in quotes is because it's what the person sees as a failure. So what we think of as a faculty member or as an advisor as a failure would be a grade that was unsuccessful, right? That's not going to allow them to progress in their program, right? For whatever reason. That may not be their frame. Their frame of failure may be that they didn't get 100 on that test, or they didn't get an A on that test or that paper, right? So that type of academic wrongness, if we start talking about the work that I've done with students here at CNHP, when they perceive it as a failure, they didn't meet their bar, they didn't meet their objective, any student can tend to get inside their own head and start having these shameful feelings about themselves, blaming themselves, not this happened, right? But I'm bad because of it, right? So that's the difference between shame and guilt, right? So you can feel guilty that you didn't study, right? But you feel shameful that you are wrong, or you're not smart enough or whatever. So it internalizes those feelings. So be on the lookout for that. It's not just the failing grade, it's their expectation and what they did. Internalizing a deficit mindset, we as an institution, all institutions, can be guilty of this. When we talk about a deficit mindset, we're talking about the thought process that students come to us not having something that they need, right, to be successful. if you flip that idea on its head and you think of it this way, there are strengths that got each and every student here, right? And they utilize those strengths. We need to focus on the strengths that brought them here, right? And then look at the challenges they have and support the challenges, not saying, oh, all first gen students need X, right? All military students need, or veteran students need this, right? That's an assumption. So we have to stop putting that out there in the culture, because when we do, the students see themselves as lacking, right? And we never want them to see themselves as lacking. We want them to see themselves as individuals who need to grow, like we all do, right? And they have limited institutional capital, which again is that capital of what is the bursar and what does that mean? They don't understand the language of higher ed, which can be confusing for me. And I've been in higher ed for a while. And I still look, sometimes I go, I don't know what that means. Now I have a little bit more self-awareness. There goes my dog, sorry. A little bit more self-awareness to realize that it's okay to ask, because not everybody knows everything, but our students don't necessarily feel that way, right? So understanding that shamefulness, like I should know what the bursar means. Okay, now I do, but back then I didn't, and kind of giving them that freedom to ask those questions. So here's just some examples, of what these different things can look like in the academic setting, where they stop coming to class or they stop raising their hand, they're unsure of how they're connected to the program, or they're connected for us as a Drexel Dragon. Like, what does that look like? They withdraw, right? Their connections to others, their connection to you, to their peers in class, they're always late. They're always coming to class later. They're not showing up at all, right? And then they seem to become sometimes more needy, so that pendulum swings the other way, rather than kind of like hiding from you, ghosting you. They're constantly emailing and constantly questioning like every single move. That's a stress response. And that can be a key that the student is experiencing shame at this particular point, at this particular junction. And then what does shame look like in the classroom? Like, why is this important? Why do we care? Because it impacts their learning. And engagement is attached to learning, right? So if we've learned nothing through the pandemic, engagement's important, right? So it will stop them from learning, because it stops them from engaging with you, with the content, with each other, right? And that is just, it becomes too painful. They're internalizing that shame. It becomes painful and hurtful, and they can't progress. And it impacts that professional role development, regardless of what the profession is that they're trying to attain, right? So they can't then internalize what they're supposed to be as a nurse, as a PA, as a PT, as a physicist, as an engineer. They can't take that in because they still don't see themselves in that light, and that shame stops them from seeing themselves.
And also, not only do we see the impact in the academic in a classroom setting, right? But we also see it when we work one-on-one with students outside of the classroom. So one of the things that we really concentrate on is that role development, right? So we're helping our students to become more independent and helping our students to become autonomous. And we can see how shame will impact that, right? Because students will think that they're lacking something, right? And Dana was talking earlier about becoming more needy, right? But it also impacts their self-awareness, right? And sometimes it can also help, impact how students balance, right, their academic and their social and personal pressures. We also see it in their student identity, right? We want our students to feel as though they belong here and that they are, with a self-worth, right? And making sure that they believe in themselves and that self-efficacy. But sometimes we see where, depending on how long they're in it, right, and being impacted by it, that it can definitely have an impact. And then we all want our students to be retained so that we can eventually see them to graduate, right? But, depending on the impact, I have seen students take the semester off. I have seen students drop out, right, and not return. So we just want to make sure that we're cognizant of what it looks like, right, and then we'll be able to address it. So what we have here, I know we're at the 35-minute mark, What we have here is a case study. We usually, for this activity, will break students up into our students. Oh my gosh, we will break participants up into groups, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go right through. But this is something that we may see, right? A situation like this. So basically, Terry's a first-year psychology student during his first semester at Rowan or at Drexel, right? He attained a 3.43 GPA. The professor had noticed that he is struggling this semester during synchronous classes. He does not turn on his camera. He hasn't been consistent in submitting his homework on time and had received a 52 on his first exam. He built a relationship with his student counselor during the fall semester, but he has been non-responsive to all forms of outreach. So, we have two questions. Number one, where are Terry touch point moments that can lead to shame? So first, we're asking about the touch point moments that can lead to shame. And number two, what interventions would you suggest to support Terry during this time? So question number one, touch points. And then we want to touch back on the interventions that you would suggest in your role, of whether you're in the classroom as faculty or if you're providing student support. And I'm going to take a step back so we can see the case study. And you can unmute your mic or you can put it in a chat. So let's first talk about what are some of the touch points where we could see shame.
Just reading this scenario, he's turning the camera off. He doesn't even want to be seen. And also, you notice something is going on because his, homework things has been happening, especially with the first exam. And let's see, Terry built a relationship with a student counselor during the fall, but he is not, he's non-responsive to all forms of outreach. So he has a lot going on.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Well, this is Sandy. I feel he'd be shameful probably after he got a low grade, 52. I mean, he might feel shame from that, and he knows deep down that he didn't submit his homework on time. So that can start shame. That's what I feel.
Yeah, especially when the student has a 3.4 GPA from the previous semester, right? So when a student starts out with a high GPA and then their first exam this semester, oh snap, I have a 52. Like, whoa, 52, 3.4. Like, what's going on? So now that's a very good point. So we touched on some of the moments, right? What intervention? So if you're working with this student as a faculty member in the School of Nursing, as a PA, PT, or if you're an advisor capacity, right? What would be some of the interventions that you will offer to Terry?
I would reach out to Terry and, normally what I do with students, I'll send an email because this has actually happened with some of my students. And I'll reach out to the student, asking them, are they okay? Would you like to meet? Try to get a feel as to what's going on. And most time, by me reaching out to them, they will respond. And then that starts to build, at least it's a conversation. And based on that conversation, I can try to direct them, give them some positive input and also some support. And maybe, what I found with students, it's good for the faculty to reach out, but sometimes they may want to reach out for that support group and with peers their own age, because sometimes they feel like you kind of too old, or shall I say seasoned? Okay, so one of the things I give them that opportunity because I want to be transparent and let them know it's okay, to build have a conversation, and then we see what happens from there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree very much with that approach. And also, he has a relationship, I get he did with his student counselor. So you could check in with the counselor and have ask the counselor to reach out. But I would reach out too by email and offer, like, would you like to talk on the phone? I'm here for you, those kinds of things. I'm here for you to assist or guide you in any way and see. And most of the time, I feel the same way. The students are responsive and they will do a phone call. I mean, I've had that experience.
Thank you so much for that. All good interventions. Anyone else? Dana, did you have one?
Just from the student services side, right? So as an advisor, right? Or we've had people who have been mentors, right, to students who are students themselves. It's important to establish that connection, but maybe take it out of the academic realm. Like, hey, Terry, haven't seen you in a while. How about we go grab some coffee? So that they don't have to, like, they don't have to see that shame of not doing well academically right away, but you're just kind of opening the door to just a conversation. And maybe that isn't surrounding their academic performance at all. Maybe that's just to make that human connection so that they feel that other people are seeing them and noticing that they're struggling. So that's something that I love that student services and student support can do with us, with faculty. If faculty sends like that flag up and says, hey, you haven't heard from Terry, he's not doing so well. Can you just do a reach out, right? So that they feel less stress and pressure from the academic side. So that's something that I've done before.
And I know from our point of view, being on the student services side, I love receiving those emails because it really also shows that that faculty member, that professor, that they care and that they're going into another step. And say, hey, and I know for TRIO, so we serve 160 students, right? So we know who our students are. But when we get that from a professor, it really means the world because it shows that you're really caring and that you're doing that, you're taking that extra step. So no, thank you so much. So let's add one more component to this, right? And tell you the rest of the story, right? So Terry didn't study well because he had the responsibility of caring for his elderly aunt. He had to accept the role of being the primary provider. So his work hours as a go food delivery person has increased due to COVID, right? So one of the things that in saying this, and I'm pretty sure that through COVID, we have heard plenty of experiences like this, where a student may have had to care for a person in their family, or they had, their actual a parent, right? Or they had to go through some different challenges, to really try to persevere and really try to make it in school. But one of the questions we really want you to think about the assumptions that we often make about students, right? Because a lot of times when we see our students, we only get one view that, wow, this student received a 52, but we don't know the backstory, right? Uh, so we often have to check our assumptions that we make without knowing the full story.
So when you're working with students, it's really important to know shame when you see it, right? So from my mental models, right, as a nurse, I'm looking for those changes in behavior and when I'm working with patients, and I kind of transition that over to working with students, right? So when is behavior telling me something, right? Because all behavior has meaning. So when you see it, are you able to identify it, act on it, and then help the students reflect and recover? And that's the important piece, right? Because this is a recoverable type of feeling. But we need to process through it.
So one of the most important things is about acting, right? Oftentimes in higher education, we sometimes wait until the student takes the action. But especially when you notice it, when you notice that, hey, this student has isolated themselves, they stop showing up, they stop interacting, they are struggling. It's okay for us to make that first act and say, hey, just checking in with you, shooting you a quick text message or shooting you an email, what's going on, right? So in this, we want to use active listening, and we really want to listen to the student to see what it is going on, right? We want to use empathy and really to try to see what we can do to help. In this also, we want to make sure that we show students that we care and really care outside of the educational route, right? We know that we have goals and we have objectives that we need to meet for our, if we're professors, or like for me, I'm the assistant director of a program, we have our goals and objectives, right? But in that too, we want to make sure that we do not forget about the student, and we want to show them that they care, or show them that we care, right? Because oftentimes students really don't care how much we know until they really know how much we care. It goes back to that old saying. So we want to make sure that we show that care. Also, in talking with students, we want to make sure that they understand that, hey, I may not be able to help you unless you invite me in, right? So those moments when that student will come to you, those moments when they will meet with you in your office hours or your virtual office hours, right? That's a sign that, hey, they trust you. And that's a good thing, right? And we want to make sure that, we show them that we care, that we're here for them, but that also we really want to help, right? And that there may need to be some vulnerability, right? In order for us to help the way that we need to. The big thing, and I know since this presentation, right, we've been doing this for almost a year, I will let a student know when they email me, Corley, I'm sorry for or I'm sorry for bothering you, or I don't want to be a burden. The first thing I let them know, listen, this is why I'm here. You are not a burden whatsoever. The door is open, right? So we want to make sure that we communicate that with them. And we want to thank them for trusting us with their vulnerability. And in your own way, make yourself available. I know for the TRIO program at Rutgers, we give students our cell phone number so that they can contact us, right? Just because at our institution, students were getting a little bit disturbed by, just office hours, right? Or I had to contact you through email, right? So for us, we didn't have, because we were not on campus, we would get on campus next week. We could have an open door policy, but we did expand to texting where students could text us, but also, making sure that we also hold those boundaries as well. I told my students, look, 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm asleep. So, just making sure that we have those boundaries, but it's really important that we act.
And a really important piece of all of this is reflection, right? They need to be students, everyone, when they have a shameful moment, you need to be able to acknowledge that shameful feeling because that can creep in, right? Kind of like out of the blue. Like you don't realize it at first, and then you can take a step back and look at yourself and say, oh, wait, I'm internalizing this. Like this wasn't a mistake I made, or maybe I didn't study enough, or whatever it was. But that's not a me thing, that's an action thing, and I can do something different next time, right? And it can get better, right? And to be able to reach out for help, that's how people kind of have to frame that feeling, right? So, and acknowledging that inadequacy in all of that, and then identifying where you have strengths, right? So again, all of our learners, all of us have strengths, right? And all of us have challenges. There's no perfect person on the planet. So everybody needs help in one way or another. And to acknowledge that and help students to work through that and to be able to reflect on that is really important. The only people who truly believe that they have no challenges are people who are really holding on to shame and they're not experiencing new things and they're not trying to learn because they're very comfortable in that wheelhouse, right? So if you're not willing to grow and you're not willing to change and develop, right? That can be someone who is really impacted by shame, that they can't move from the space they are and they're very comfortable with where they are, but they're not comfortable with anything outside of their norm, right? Of what they already know they know, right? And that can be dangerous. That impacts learning. So parts of overcoming shame, right, is accepting that help. And that can be very difficult, right? Because you have to be vulnerable to accept other people's help, right? Even in little bits. There are 5 steps to the recovery process in shame, right? It's kind of the phases that people need to go through. And then at the end of it, ensure that they're empowered to be able to give back. Now, we've seen some absolutely creative ways for students to be able to do this, as coming up and mentoring other students, right? Or coming and doing presentations at Flying First, the first gen symposium at Rowan. We see that where the students, especially for the first gen students, because that's what the focus is, they're able to give back to that first gen community and say, I was here too. And this is how I leveraged, my strengths. And you can do that too. That's really important.
So we're in the home stretch, but we wanted to end on the shame recovery process. And when Van Vliet wrote this, really this was tailored to mental health clinicians, right? People who are therapists and they work with students, with patients. But looking at this, we found that there's some things that we could do as faculty and as practitioners to help aid in this recovery process. And really one big takeaway that we want to really make sure we mention is that we really want to help our students to recover. We really don't want our students to stay in it, right? But we really want them to see that there's a way that they can recover and that they can be successful. So just to start out, it's just about connecting, right? This is something that we can do. We can really help our students to connect to different organizations on campus, connect to one another. We may ask that in this, the student connects to a therapist that's in our wellness center on campus, right? And that's fine for us to suggest that. But here's the other thing too, they can also connect with us. There are times that I have walked with students, so they would share their experience or they would go to therapy, they would come back and I said, okay, hey, let me walk with you for the next month. Well, we can meet every week to see how everything is going. Or, hey, here's my cell phone number. Send me a text message after that class. Send me a text message just to let me know that you're okay. So that connection piece, right? That connection piece is really important. We also want to help our students to refocus, right? So we want to shift that student's energy, right? And their mindset off of the shame and more so to their goals, right? What is it that they plan to do? Some of those positive behaviors. And that will really help us to counterbalance that feeling of powerlessness or that paralysis, right? One of the things I do with my students is in this refocus, again, going right back to what Dennis said, we are focusing on your strengths, right? We're focusing on what you do well, right? And those achievements. And here's the thing, I know I can't dance very well. Only thing I got is a 2-step, but I want to celebrate those small wins, right? When you start to take those small steps, I'm doing a little dance, I'm doing a little shimmy, a cha-cha slide, I'm going to do something. But I just want to make sure that students know that I'm here to celebrate your progress as well, even if it's at a small step at a time. Now, for the next 3, you are probably going to need the help of a therapist, right? Because when it comes to, for example, that acceptance piece, that's the transition, right? From that avoidance, right? To now really accepting the conversation. So the situation. So one of the things I know as a practitioner, I stay in my lane, I stay in my scope of practice, right? So my general rule is I don't like to open up anything that I don't have the experience or the tools to close. So for that acceptance piece, that's probably better for your clinician. But when it comes to understanding, that could be something that the clinician does. But oftentimes after a student has met with their clinician in mental health or in a wellness center, sometimes I will ask, hey, what did you learn from that situation? Because that also helps with creating some meaning. And those are some of the lessons that students will take as they move forward, right? And then finally, resisting. How do we keep you in a good place? How do we help you to develop the actions and the attitudes that will protect yourself against those assaults of shame, right? Whether it's self-blame. And this here is where we're building self-efficacy, but we're also going to work to reject some of those negative judgments, right? And help you to kind of like not self-internalize those things, right? So these are some of the things that we suggest. Van Vliet, her article is great. We're going to share it right after it. But like I said, I really think these are some of the tips and tools that we can use to help our students to recover.
And these are just some resources that we used to prepare our presentation today. Brene Brown actually does some amazing work with shame resilience theory. So that's her article, Grounded Theory Study on Women and Shame. I know she's kind of like a pop culture type of person now, and you can see her on social media and all that stuff, but she actually did do some work, right? Some academic work when it comes to shame. There's a link to her TED Talk, as well as the Red Table Talk that she did. It's episode 13 for those of you who listen to Red Table Talk. They're on Facebook or have other social media links to that. So please take a look at these resources. And then in our next slide, we have the two references that we keep speaking about, which are Van Vliet and Hazmat. Hashmat is pretty clear and really breaks it out from Psychology Today, just those 5 factors that can make you feel shame. And know that shame is not just something that is experienced by students. I've seen faculty experience it. I've seen many different people experience shame. So this may be a tool that you can use not only with your learners, but also with your colleagues, and understand that we're all learners in this space. And every single day, you're going to learn something new and something different if you open your heart and your mind to it. Thank you so much for attending today. Does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to share at this point?
Thank you. I thought the presentation was very informative, and I appreciate it. So thank you, Dana. And is it Darren? I hope I'm saying that name right. Dr. Did I say the other name? Daron. Okay, nice to meet you. Thank you.
Nice to meet you as well. Glad you enjoyed.
Yeah, I agree, Denise. Thank you, Darren and Dana. It's a great presentation. Very inclusive and very, inclusive and welcoming and supportive of our students and of faculty. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dana and Daron, for joining us today. And thanks, everybody, for joining us for today's Tuesday topic. See you next time. Thanks.